Well, it is Good Friday here in the United States, and it's almost the end of the day over in merry old Ireland. How are you today, David?
Chris, I'm good. It's 8:30 here, so there is a bit of a time difference. But I'm happy to be, talking about the course again. Very timely and interesting topic. I think we're going to focus on today.
Yeah, since it's Good Friday, we thought we would take a look at the Holy Week as it is presented to us in A Course in Miracles, and maybe I'll just start off here with this first paragraph in section 20, or in chapter 20, section 1. This is Palm Sunday, the celebration of victory and acceptance of the truth. Let us not spend this Holy Week brooding on the crucifixion of God's Son, but happily in the celebration of his release. For Easter is a sign of peace, not pain. A slain Christ has no meaning, but a risen Christ becomes a symbol of the Son of God's forgiveness on himself, the sign he looks upon himself as healed and whole. And that is a somewhat radical reinterpretation of a lot of the stories we have heard about the death and resurrection of Jesus, because often people are putting such emphasis on the gore and the horror and the darkness of this event, and yet it would appear that Jesus is telling us that he was able to move through this passage in life almost effortlessly in order to prove the point that none of this is real. So what are your thoughts on this, David?
Well, it's a very important chapter, and obviously he talks about, the crucifixion and times in the course, but he's focusing on it here in Holy Week, and it's a complete reinterpretation of the way we probably traditionally thought of this entire thing. The idea that, and it gets into it here, but it talks about things like the idea of sacrifice, and what the actual crucifixion meant, and more importantly, what the resurrection symbolizes. So it wasn't necessarily this thing that we all should feel morose and bad about. Quite the opposite is true. It's I think he talks about it's a time of joy, Holy Week, to focus on life, not on death. So very, very 360-degree interpretation.
You want to go ahead and take this next?
I will continue. Yeah, sure. So this week begins with palms and ends with lilies. The white and holy sign of the Son of God is innocent. Let no dark sign of crucifixion intervene between the journey and its purpose, between the acceptance of the truth and its expression. This week we celebrate life, not death, and we honor the perfect purity of the Son of God and not his sins. Offer your brother the gift of lilies, not the crown of thorns, and not the gift of fear. You stand beside your brother, thorns in one hand and lilies in the other, uncertain which to give. Join now with me and throw away the thorns, offering the lilies to replace them. This Easter, I would have the gift of your forgiveness offered by you to me and returned by me to you. We cannot be united in crucifixion and in death, nor can the resurrection be complete till your forgiveness rests on Christ, along with mine. So what do you think of that, Chris?
Well, this is a really juicy paragraph, because we've got a lot of ideas being presented to us in a very condensed form. The first being that that old disruption in existence, the whole idea of condemnation, is the first thing that he addresses here, by giving us this realization that you can either judge and condemn someone, or you can refrain from judgment and step to that higher level and exercise forgiveness, which will help you ultimately to attain that level of recognition that none of this is real in truth. And so even forgiveness is not a necessary thing. So we're getting, the primary themes of A Course in Miracles presented to us, but in a very personal way, because Jesus is talking about events that we associate with his life. And so I think it's, it's very salient that it comes through in this format so that we can comprehend that that very significant statement he made as recorded in the book of Luke, when he was being crucified, and he said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." So forgiveness is the core of what this particular period in time is all about.
The thing that struck me in that paragraph was, and obviously it's mentioned elsewhere, is the image of the crown of thorns. And what is a crown? A crown is something to be worn proudly. And it's a demonstration of, well, in a king, if we think in terms of something regal, like it's something to be worn, a sign of dominance or a sign of value. And obviously a crown of thorns is a very, very violent image. We think of suffering and cruelty. So the ego's crown is, or the way the value to the ego is suffering. And Jesus compares that to the image of the lilies, which is a very, very peaceful symbol that is to be offered to your brother. Very stark contrast he's drawn between what forgiveness is and what maybe even occasionally the ego's idea of forgiveness is. So it's quite black and white. It's saying there's my path to forgiveness, and then there's the ego's idea of what I think the ego's path to salvation. And it gets onto it a little bit later on, but what is the ego's salvation? What does the ego think will bring you salvation or atonement? And that is suffering, pain. And we see that a lot in this theme on Easter, which is, I talk to a lot of people who are Catholic, and if you bring up the idea that Jesus didn't die for our sins, they can get a little bit emotional or a bit disturbed by that concept that, was there a price to be paid for salvation? And if there wasn't, well, what does that mean about suffering in general in the world? Do we need to wear the crown of thorns? Maybe it's unnecessary.
Oh, it absolutely is unnecessary. And, again, this is where a lot of Christians unwittingly end up falling back into Judaism, because the God of the Jews was a God that demanded punishment and demanded sacrifice. This period of time in Jewish tradition, you would go to the temple and offer a lamb or a dove or some other animal to be slaughtered in order to appease God. And when you actually study history and look at what was going on at the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, the descriptions were that this was a slaughterhouse where animals were being sacrificed at such an incredible pace that they had these channels that they had built for the blood, so that the blood could be drained off and addressed later on. So on the high holy days in the old Judaic tradition, it was, kill one animal after another, rather than to have to kill yourself to appease God. And Jesus, stepping out of that kind of an environment, out of that kind of a cultural situation, when he started talking about God and forgiveness for the illusion of sin, he introduced a very radical thought, which was a huge step away from what was the practice of the era. So this is a dramatic and eventful period of time, the feast of the Passover or the passage of Easter, because when you compare the two paths, Jesus was definitely striking out in his own direction in a very dramatic way.
Something that came to mind today as well when I was reading this section was on this whole idea of sacrifice. And another section from the Bible, and I'm no Bible scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but it must have been the Old Testament, I guess. It was the story of Abraham and was it Isaac, his son, where he was asked to sacrifice, show that he had real faith in God. And I think when you read sections like that in the Bible with the sort of the ego mindset or the ego perception, those passages can seem like really vicious and really cruel. I mean, what kind of God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? But I think that story, if it's reinterpreted, if you can reinterpret it with maybe a different perception, it's something like maybe he was asking Abraham to give up a certain type of special relationship, and as soon as God realized that he was willing to give up that relationship, and obviously that story in the Bible is a very extreme example, which is exactly what the crucifixion was. It was a demonstration, a very, very severe, demonstration or a clear demonstration. But maybe he was just asking Abraham to give up some sort of special relationship. And once he saw that, I think the Bible even says that he learned to fear God. And now I think in Hebrew, the word fear actually, it is no connotations of actual, fear as we understand it. It means more awe, or to be in awe, or to give respect to. So I don't think, obviously, God stops Abraham before he actually does do that. And what Jesus is telling us in the Course of Miracles is that you're never asked to sacrifice anything, ever. But it was just another clear example of, I think, the way the ego is prone to hear things fearfully, and it will interpret things fearfully, no matter. I mean, Jesus came back, and 2,000 years ago, he was probably teaching nothing but love. But it was, of course, he was talking to a lot of egos. And whatever Jesus said to them was probably going to be misinterpreted because they were so fearful. And it's an interesting way to think about it, because I think probably if Jesus, whatever it was that Jesus said back then, it probably didn't matter an awful lot. It was more the energy of who he was. And I think I mentioned that before, but the entire idea of sacrifice has been put under the microscope in this section.
Yeah, that is true. And it was, I think it was a very hard concept for, as you had stated, for the people at that timeline to actually shift away from this hardline, ancient code of Hammurabi, basically, is what it was. Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth.
Yeah.
But we do know that 450 years earlier, the Buddha had lived in India and was, committed to pacifism in the extreme. And one of the interesting side notes around that was one of the schools of Buddhism. I think it was called the Akash school. It was from southern India. And it was very unusual in that Buddhists do not send out missionaries normally. But that particular school had sent out missionaries, and those missionaries landed in Egypt and Rome and Athens and Jerusalem. So we know historically it's very conceivable that Jesus had discussions with these Buddhist monks who had come, across from India, and who were having contact and intellectual intercourse with a lot of different societies in that region. So, we can begin to see how there was a pollination process going on here. And that may have perhaps been part of the journey that Jesus made. It was the trigger that he needed to go even deeper into the idea of forgiveness rather than sacrifice and revenge. So we see a whole cosmology here starting to come together that is so atypical of what Christianity teaches us, that it's like two entirely different worlds, two solar systems, light years apart from each other. So within that, we'll take this next paragraph here and see what this has to say.
Mm-hmm.
It says, a week is short, and yet this Holy Week is the symbol of the whole journey the Son of God has undertaken. He started with a sign of victory, the promise of the resurrection already given him. Let him not wander into the temptation of crucifixion and delay him there. Help him to go in peace beyond it, with the light of his own innocence, lighting his way to his redemption and release. Hold him not back with thorns and nails when his redemption is so near, but let the whiteness of your shining gift of lilies speed him on his way to the resurrection. And shortly before all of these events around the crucifixion, Jesus had given us the Beatitudes, wherein he talks of the lilies. Consider the lilies of the field. Who among you is cloaked in such splendor? So this theme of lilies replacing thorns and purity replacing this pollution that we experience when we're indulging in the ego becomes quite visceral as we enter into this first part of this chapter.
Well, again, when I heard you reading that section, we mentioned in another video that this course is entirely holographic. So you'll see little bits of truth being dropped into paragraphs that you can recognize from different sections. And a word that jumped out at me there as I heard you read that was the word delay. So it says, let him not wander into the temptation of crucifixion and delay him there. So Jesus is asking us not to go back into temptation because he doesn't want us to delay, right? It's not like Jesus is going to hold it against us if we do get tempted by the old idea of sacrifice and separation and crucifixion. He's just imploring us to, there's no need to delay here any longer than is necessary, because he's already proven through the resurrection and through the perfect act of forgiveness that his life was, that there's no need to hang around here anymore. We don't need to waste time. And that's exactly what the course is trying to do. We're going to wake up. In fact, it's already happened. But the course is just, let's not delay any longer than necessary here in this dream that's playing out. We can speed it up. But I think I want to continue, Chris, if that's okay, because the next line in the next paragraph is very, very revealing, I think. And it says, Easter is not the celebration of the cost of sin, but of its end. And if you see glimpses of the face of Christ behind the veil, looking between the snow white petals of the lilies you have received and given as your gift, you will behold your brother's face and recognize it. I was a stranger, and you took me in, not knowing who I was. Yet for your gift of lilies, you will know. In your forgiveness of this stranger, alien to you, and yet your ancient friend, lies his release and your redemption with him. The time of Easter is a time of joy and not of mourning. Look on your risen friend and celebrate his holiness along with me, for Easter is the time of your salvation along with mine. And I'll ask you, Chris, as well, but the thing there, the very first line of that section is Easter is not the celebration of the cost of sin. So the cost, he sounds almost like an economist there. He's talking about barter and trade, which is entirely of the ego. So at the moment of separation, the very first instance of separation, what was the lie? The ego, or the ego story, the ego narrative was, well, you know, you did it now, and in order for you to be a separate self, there's a price to pay here. Something has to be given here. We can't, you know, you can't just have that. The cost, of course, is that God is now dead. You've killed God to be your separate self, and the whole thing after that is about atoning through suffering. There is a price for everything, and we see a price, the barter, the trade situation dynamic going on in all the special relationships we have here in the world.
Yeah, it's very typical of, again, as you said, the ego's agenda, because once we get into that trade-off mindset, we demand what appears to be equality. You know, in our rational mind, we're saying, well, you know, I did this for you and you must do that for me. And we approach forgiveness the same way. I'll forgive you if you will forgive me. But really the bottom line is, you know, until you really comprehend that there is only one life, only one of us, you can't really fully appreciate the value of absolute and total forgiveness for everybody you encounter, because ultimately you're forgiving yourself over and over and over again on a multitude of different levels. So
it's like there is only one ego. You know, there is only, you know, everything has to be brought back in here to where real forgiveness is, because ultimately, you know, we think we're forgiven the external world. Everything is self-forgiveness, and once you forgive yourself, you know, you experience what the Course calls the happy dream. But you know, it's always a mistake people make, think that, well, I have to forgive that person. It's always about yourself. It's always about bringing back the projections that you see out there as an aspect of an unhealed part of your own mind that needs to be given back to where it belongs, effectively.
Right, exactly. And,
so yeah,
it actually goes a little bit further than that, in that if you have a dog or a cat or a pet mule or whatever, and you are abusive, you are demanding, you are punitive in any way with any manifestation of life around you, then you are in fact attacking yourself. So it's not just limited to this idea of people, of humans, because there is no differentiation in the presence of God. God is life, period. No matter what the appearance of that life may seem to be. So we have to, you know, we have to include our pets and the neighbor's dog that barks at 3 a.m. and things like that in this entire journey.
I think it even goes to inanimate objects. I mean, there can be a forgiveness lesson around, let's say, silly example maybe, but after Thanksgiving or Christmas, when you try on that pair of jeans, and they don't quite fit as well as they used to, and we say, oh, these bloody jeans, you know. we think the jeans are the problem, when really it's the frustration or a little bit of anger there in yourself that needs to be, or self-judgment that needs to be brought back in. We project onto everything. It can be a relationship with anything, I think, and yeah, everything is an opportunity.
Exactly. And that's, you know, that's the core of living the Course in Miracles, is to actually arrive at that place where you're not living in a space of judgment, but merely observing and accepting the illusion for what it is, but knowing that it is not real. And so that kind of finishes up this first section from chapter 20, the Vision of Holiness. And in about a week here, we'll get together, reconvene, and explore the next section. Does that sound reasonable?
Sounds great. There's a lot of really great stuff in this section, and you know, we could talk forever on it. But I think for now, it's probably just the takeaway is that, you know, the old way of thinking we may have had about the sacrifice that Jesus made. I mean, if we're talking about Jesus from a point of view of what's said in this book, Jesus was entirely awake, so he had all the illusions about him being a body or about being attached to anything in the world. They were all gone for him. They did not mean anything to him, which meant that Jesus could not suffer. It was impossible for Jesus to suffer. So what does that mean about this whole story we've been telling ourselves about how he died for our sins? Maybe we just need to start subtly re-examining that and fully, and if you have accepted it, really you know, live your life and start to practice the forgiveness he talks about, you know, offering lilies to your brother. Because that is the only way we can get back to where we need to be. That's the only thing we need to focus on, is just that act of forgiveness and applying it in our day-to-day lives. So I look forward to the next section, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a great experience, and we'll be doing these every week that we can coordinate our connection here. And we invite you to not only enjoy the broadcast, but to share. And if you would like to go ahead and subscribe to my channel and to David's channel, and you'll be aware of each new edition that we put out. So I know you've got something going on this evening, David, so get out there and have a great evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Chris. Talk soon.
Bye.